Welcome back everyone to our studies in business law and practice for the SQE. This video we are continuing going through this part of the specification, looking at all the different types of business and organisational structures. We've spent time looking at the sole trader, we've spent time looking at the idea of the partnership. I'm going to skip past the LLP for a second, the limited liability partnership, because I'm going to focus on that at the end of this little series of videos and instead talk about the idea of the company. So that's essentially what we're going to be doing in this lesson. We'll be spending some time introducing the idea of the company. And it's important to realise that for the most part, business law and practice involves examining the idea of the company. Examining the nature of the company, looking at corporate governance and compliance, looking at finance, debt and equity security, for example, and all these different kinds of things, and also taxation involving corporations as well. So we'll spend a lot of our time examining this in more detail in future lessons, but it's important and it's pertinent now, in my opinion, to just spend some time examining what in fact is a company. Well, a company is the first of these business structures that we're looking at that goes through a process of incorporation. So if we noted back to our previous videos where we looked at the delineation between the incorporated and the non-incorporated business, the unincorporated business, the company is the first that squarely fits into the incorporated section, the section on incorporation. And this means that a company goes through a process known as incorporation. And it essentially means that when you create a company, when you make the decision, I'm going to go and build a company, you are creating an entity which in fact has separate legal personhood. Unlike a sole trader where you just are your business, okay, a company exists separately to you. You have you who runs the business, maybe you're the company director, and then you have the company itself, which is a separate entity that has separate legal personality. The company is then able to take on her own assets, her own liabilities, which can then limit your liability directly for the debts that may be incurred by that corporation. And that's the idea of a limited liability corporation. Additionally, if a person who runs the business dies or maybe retires, for example, the company would still exist. And this is unlike the case of a sole trader in which that business and that company disappears at the point at which the corporation no longer, or at least, the business that you run as a sole trader no longer exists as you leave that particular business. And so a company will still exist, and you have to go through certain processes of winding up or ending the corporation and ending the company itself that is separate to just leaving and stop working, for example, or retiring or dying. There are a couple of different types of company that exist. So, for example, there are private companies and there are public companies. Companies can also be limited by shares, or they could be limited by guarantee. We'll get to all of this in future videos. If you feel like we're not going through this in any great detail yet, I'll talk about this in far more detail in future videos. Just you wait. The regulation of the company then. So companies are regulated mostly under the 2006 Companies Act. That's where we see the sort of incorporation, pardon the pun, of lots of different provisions of law into a really big chunky piece of legislation. It's actually massive, the Companies Act, that really regulates most aspects of business and company related issues. Now, there are things that you'll be very familiar with the Companies Act as we go through the course of this series of lessons. You're going to become very familiar with lots of different aspects of the Companies Act. There are additionally also legislation involved in things like insolvency proceedings, so the Insolvency Act is also something that we'll reference as well. But for the most part, if you're looking at regulating a company, you're looking at the Companies Act from 2006. And so fundamentally then, what we will do in the next video is just spend some more time talking about this idea of separate legal personhood and separate legal personality, because I want to spend a little bit of time talking about where this principle comes from, some of the case law on this principle, and what the implications are for having this kind of principle associated with the company, because it fundamentally defines what a company is, and it fundamentally defines what the idea of limited liability is, and this has major consequences, not only for the business itself, the idea of the company itself, but also it has major consequences for the idea of insolvency, the process of actually winding a company up and going into insolvent liquidation, into bankruptcy, and all these different kinds of things. All those things are really important, of course, for our studies when we look at insolvency later on in this series of videos.